changing your life one story at a time. This is the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast with Editor-in-Chief Amy Newmark.
Hey, it's Amy Newmark with your daily dose of Chicken Soup for the Soul inspiration. It's Wow Wednesday, which means that today I get to share one of my favorite stories in what I call the How Did That Happen category. We haven't had a love story in a while on the podcast, so it's definitely time for one. Because who doesn't love a love story? This one is from our book called Chicken Soup for the Soul, True Love, and the story title is Mr. Brownlee. Our storyteller, Cheryl, tells us that it was in her senior year of high school that she started telling people, including her very own boyfriend, that she knew who she was going to marry. She had had a dream, and when she woke up, she knew she was going to marry this new teacher at school. He was young, good-looking. He taught accounting, and he also coached the basketball team, and his name was Mr. Brownlee. Now, Cheryl told her boyfriend she was going to marry Mr. Brownlee, and he didn't even care. He just laughed at her because nearly every girl in their small farming town had a crush on Mr. Brownlee. Not only was he attractive with a magnetic personality and he carried himself with confidence, but he also looked a lot like Clark Kent from Superman. So Cheryl's dream about marrying Mr. Brownlee became a joke among her friends and their parents. And Cheryl didn't marry Mr. Brownlee. She went off to college, she got a job, and she married someone else. But after 5 years, Cheryl got divorced from that man, and she took the son from that marriage, and a few years later, she took him on a trip to California for Christmas break. And on New Year's Eve, at the end of their vacation, they headed back to Ohio, flying from Orange County to Pittsburgh, where they would get a flight back to Dayton. And while they were waiting at their gate in Pittsburgh during their 2-hour layover, who did Cheryl see but the handsome Mr. Brownlee? He still looked like Clark Kent. Cheryl didn't know what to do. Should she talk to him? But she got up her courage and she approached him and she introduced herself. And Mr. Brownlee remembered her, but not because he thought he was going to marry her. It was just that she had been one of his first students when he was a brand new teacher. They started talking, and then Mr. Brownlee said, "So where are you sitting on the plane?" And Cheryl said, "Seats 35, B, and C." And Mr. Brownlee pulled out his own boarding pass, and he had been assigned 35A. So they sat next to each other, and they talked all the way to Dayton on that flight. And it turned out that Mr. Brownlee wasn't married or engaged or even dating anyone. He was still teaching, but in a larger town nearby. The flight was way too short. When it was over, Cheryl gave Mr. Brownlee her business card and said she could get him free tickets to sports events because of her job at a radio station, and she knew he loved sports. So would he want to go to a game? He said he might and that he would call her, but then he didn't call. And Cheryl ran into someone who knew him a couple of days later, and that woman said, "Mr. Brownlee will never call you. You're going to have to call him." So Cheryl did call him, but it didn't go well. It was an awkward conversation, and then he said he had to get off the phone because he was watching the game. Cheryl felt like an idiot. But then that same friend said to her again, "You got to call Mr. Brownlee again." And that time, she and Mr. Brownlee talked for hours, and they started talking on the phone all the time. But still, Mr. Brownlee never asked her out. It was really becoming clear why a man who looked like Clark Kent wasn't dating anyone. And Cheryl became disgusted. She said to Mr. Brownlee, "I have no idea what is going on here, but I'm 33 and you're 41, and I'm not participating anymore. I'm hanging up." I can't believe how dense Mr. Brownlee was, but finally she got through to him, and he said, No, wait. I just didn't know you were interested in me." After all those phone calls, he still hadn't figured it out. So now that he knew, he asked her out, and then on the very first date, he said, and all the women are going to die out there, he said, "Look, I'm not into dating, so if you're not working towards marriage, then I think I should just drop you off at home and forget it." Like, what man says that? This guy was like an angel. Unbelievable, right? A week later, Mr. Brownlee proposed, and 6 months later, Cheryl and Mr. Brownlee got married on the porch of the island house on Mackinac Island in Michigan. So Cheryl did become Mrs. Brownlee. 15 years after she had that dream that she was going to marry him. I love these meant-to-be romance stories. My own son-in-law says he fell in love with my daughter in high school, but he had to wait 13 years until she was ready to be more than, quote, just a friend. And they didn't get married until they were in their early 30s. So it just shows these things can really work out and they're worth the wait. Tomorrow will be an interesting day. It's Thoughtful Thursday, and I'm going to tell you a story that will open your mind so that you can see that what you might have thought was disappointing is actually a big benefit to you. I'm Amy Newmark. Thank you for listening to the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast today. And tell your friends about the podcast. I love sharing these stories. I work very hard preparing them for you. And the more listeners, the merrier. And if you'd like to read more awesome romantic love stories from Chicken Soup for the Soul, True Love, please go to our website, chickensoup.com.